Today, we want to introduce you to some of the context of this report, with 2 stories from our history and 3 examples from Unitarian Universalism today.
And I'm going to tell us a story about the man pictured here, Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown. Push our box out of the way. Great. So, before he became a minister, Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown was born on the island of Jamaica over 100 years ago. And when he was a boy, he attended a Christian church on Sunday mornings, much like our church, but they said some different things at that church. And one thing they said was a creed that declared that God was 3 things that were one thing. There was God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And one Sunday, when he was a teenager, Reverend Ethelred decided that that creed no longer made sense to him. And it just so happened that afternoon, he went to his uncle's house and found on the table a booklet written by the Reverend William Ellery Channing, a Unitarian minister in the United States. And the booklet had the words, "The Lord our God is one God." And Ethelred thought, yes, that makes sense. He borrowed the booklet from his uncle, he took it home and he read it, and after a little while, he decided to declare that he himself was a Unitarian. Now, there were no Unitarian churches in Jamaica at that time, and he knew that he would have to find his own way, and that's what he did. He got married, he had 4 children, and he worked as an accountant. And when Ethelred was 32 years old, he decided to become a Unitarian minister and start a Unitarian church in Jamaica. He remembered that the Reverend William Ellery Channing was from the United States, and he wrote a letter addressed to any Unitarian minister in New York City. Surprisingly, it arrived to a minister who wrote back and suggested that he go to a school in the United States to study the ministry. So he saved money. And you can see that, Frank, could we get the slides up there? Great. There's an image of the school that he attended in Pennsylvania, the Meadville Theological Seminary. And it took him a while to get there. He had to save money, raise money, and get immigration papers. So 3 years after he made that decision, he arrived at Meadville. And after 2 years, he was awarded a degree in theology, and he was invited to become ordained in the Unitarian denomination. That was in 1912. So this was a proud achievement because Reverend Ethelred became the first Black person to be ordained a Unitarian minister, and also the first Jamaican and Black person to attend and graduate from that seminary. Now, here's the trouble. When it came time to take a job as a church minister, Reverend Ethelred faced discrimination because of the color of his skin. His professors told Reverend Ethelred that he couldn't take a job as a minister at a church with white people because they wouldn't accept a Black person as a minister. So the professors at Meadville thought he couldn't be a minister after all, but that didn't stop Ethelred, though it must have hurt him deeply. Still, he found a way. He went back to Jamaica, and he did start a Unitarian church there. He preached about the unity of God and the rights of the people to earn fair wages. After 8 years, he decided to return to the United States, and his family moved to New York City, and in 1920, he started the Harlem Community Church. Now, it wasn't easy in Jamaica, and it wasn't easy in Harlem. The American Unitarians did not offer much money to help his brand new congregation, so it was up to Reverend Ethelred. However, the people came. People attended his church who were Black and white, worshiping together. And for the next 35 years, hundreds of people found their way to Reverend Ethelred's church to pray and learn, worship and sing just like we do at our congregation. So Reverend Ethelred found his way. He persevered despite racist treatment by our church. Much later, the Unitarian Church in America sought to partially make amends for his poor treatment earlier in his career. A hymn was named after him, and he was offered a pension.
In this morning's opening words, Viola Abbott said that, quote, "We are brought here today by the fact that Unitarian Universalism has fallen short of the image that was presented to the world and to many of those who embraced this religion," unquote. These shortcomings are well documented in the report of the UUA Commission on Institutional Change that a group of us have been studying for the past several months. That report goes into exhaustive detail of just how prevalent white supremacy culture is within Unitarian Universalism and makes extensive recommendations to advance long-term change. While those recommendations were aimed at structural changes at the UUA level, they are relevant at the personal and congregational level as well. We are admonished to approach the report with humility. We are admonished to approach the report with the humility and resolve of a truth and reconciliation council. We must understand that as a living tradition, our faith's survival depends on its relevance, and relevance depends on accepting and addressing the truth of the findings of the commission. UU Nashua has some experience in this aspect of change and reconciliation. A little over 5 years ago, we learned that the Reverend Jeffrey Campbell, a mid-20th century Black Universalist minister, attended the First Universalist Society of Nashua as a child and teenager. Jeffrey Campbell was not a name that was in any of the history written about this congregation, and we wondered why. We combed our church archives and the local newspaper files, tracked down and spoke with his two daughters, queried churches where we knew he had worked, and sifted through books, articles, and correspondence relevant to Jeffrey Campbell. We found that Jeffrey and his younger sister Marguerite grew up in Nashua in the earliest 20th century and attended the Nashua Universalist Church with their mother, Lillian Campbell. As adults, Jeffrey became a Universalist, then a Unitarian Universalist minister, and Marguerite worked for the Unitarian Universalist Association for many years. Despite their commitment to our faith, both Jeffrey and Marguerite faced racism and discrimination from Universalists, Unitarian Universalists, and the institutions of our faith throughout their lives because they were Black. Jeffrey was never called to full-time ministry of a UU congregation. This journey led us to discover that Jeffrey, his mother Lillian, and sister Marguerite were all buried in an unmarked grave in Edgewood Cemetery here in Nashua. Motivated by this ultimate denial of the worth and dignity of the Campbell family, we set about raising money for a proper gravestone and planned and presented a service of remembrance and reconciliation in 2018, and dedicated and renamed our chapel as the Campbell Chapel. In our Wonderbox story this morning, we learned that the Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown found his way. He persevered despite racist treatment by our church. The Reverend Jeffrey Campbell also stayed in this faith and dedicated his life in service to it because he truly believed in the vision of universal love. Near the end of his life, after all he had experienced, he wrote, "I would still undercall I would undertake the call had I my life to relive. His and Marguerite's perseverance in this faith, despite all the times Universalists and Unitarian Universalists failed to live up to their ideals, was matched only by the perseverance of the racism and white supremacy working against them. And this is why we also rededicate ourselves to the work of dismantling white supremacy, starting right here in this congregation. Thank you.
We have shared 2 stories from our past. Now we want to share some stories from the present. These stories come in the form of avatars created by the Commission on Institutional Change. There are 5 total in the report, and we are going to share 3 of them with you today. The avatars do not represent actual single people, but instead represent the themes the Commission saw represented in strong and consistent patterns. The avatars are composites of the testimonies that were submitted and those that came out of focus groups. They give some picture of people who are part of Unitarian Universalism today. We will be reading excerpts from each of these avatars and will share links to the full text. Our first avatar is Mallory Ramesh. She is 35, queer, Indian, a board member of her congregation, and a social activist. I joined my local UU church after meeting some UUs at a Black Lives Matter rally. After a couple of months of attending service and a book club, the minister asked me to join the board. I thought this was kind of rushed. At the book club, I'd noticed that whenever any question about people of color came up, I was the one everybody turned to look at. I'm Indian. It was funny considering that my suggestion that we add pronouns to our name tags was dismissed by the woman heading the LGBTQ council, even though I am also queer. I thought I could do some good as a board member, so I agreed. Despite reluctance by some established church leaders, we participated in the white supremacy teach-in. At the following board meeting, I inquired about how we plan to implement the recommendations from the teach-in. Our outgoing, settled minister shut down the conversation and suggested it would be more appropriate to bring up the issue with our interim minister. When I did so at the following meeting, the interim minister said she wanted to wait until she got to know the congregation. The next month, our interim said again that she wanted more time. At the following meeting, the issue was pushed to the end of the agenda, and when another issue turned into a long discussion, the majority of the board members decided it was too late to discuss anything else. Leading up to the next meeting, I wrote 2 emails asking for the issue to be placed on the meeting agenda. Both emails were ignored before they finally responded to the 3rd. At the meeting, I decided to bring up my concerns with how the recommendations had been handled, especially considering that the adoption of a practice regarding environmental justice had passed easily with no similar delays. The board secretary, a white woman, immediately centered herself and her own discomfort, framing the situation as an attack on herself by me. The issue was left unresolved at the end of the meeting, and it was extremely uncomfortable for me. During this period, my relationship with the board members in question soured, and several church members engaged in a whisper campaign against me, seemingly targeting my social justice views, with one member joking that I had issued a fatwa against mentioning U.S. presidents in sermons after I'd related complaints about an Independence Day reflection. Unwilling to encounter this on Sunday mornings, I stopped attending. Though I finished my board term, I missed meetings. I dropped out of the book club and no longer attend anything at the congregation.
The second avatar we would like to share today is about Darian Spotswood, Black disabled femme. Well, I've experienced harm in various ways as a Black person within Unitarian Universalism. Most of the harm done to me has been from UU ministers or seminarians, despite their lofty declarations of collegiality. During seminary, I was called a quota filler, was told it would be easier if I were not there. I have spent several different chapter meetings listening to white colleagues compete with one another over the number of African American or Black congregant members. I was asked by a colleague during ministry days to park his car. He tried to hand me his keys, even though I was wearing a GA badge and had known him for years. I was invited to preach at a colleague's church, and he put a fellow woman of color colleague's picture on the front cover with my name. For years, colleagues would ask if I was in preliminary fellowship. Why is this important? I don't know. But when I would say no, they looked at best surprised and at worst as if I were lying. On a day I received final, now full fellowship, I was asked over and over if I were getting preliminary fellowship, and one colleague loudly insisted I was in the wrong line and needed to gather within the ministers getting preliminary fellowship. On the last two occasions, colleagues have argued that they know more about the experience of racism and oppression than I do, as they marched with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and one had worked with Nelson Mandela. Many colleagues have told me that I am being intimidating and that I should assume goodwill. Many of the candidates for ministry use Black and dark in negative ways. When I asked them what their theology of darkness was, they said things like the absence of God or evil and sinful. When I pressed them about the impact this might have on members of their congregation who identified as Black or brown, a white male colleague reprimanded me and defended this use of language and wouldn't back down until a white female colleague affirmed what I was saying. The objectification of female candidates and colleagues was also a regular feature of the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. Male panel members would describe women as attractive and young as if that had anything to do with their qualifications. To be female and of color is more than a double whammy.
Our final avatar is Genevieve Mills. She is a white, heterosexual, cisgender woman.
I've spent most of my career working with adolescents and had the chance to join an organization on reentry programs for youth offenders. My work gave me a close-up look at vagaries and biases in the criminal justice system, and I started to learn to identify systematic racism. I joined my congregation's Social Justice Committee after the shooting of Michael Brown and the uprising in Ferguson. At the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, I knew we needed to get more white people engaged in changing these systems. I advocated for hanging a Black Lives Matter banner on our congregation's building when the call went out for congregants to support the movement with this action in early 2015. Our committee debated the idea for a few meetings, and then we had to do congregational education before asking for a congregational vote. I found the gathering of signatures and conversations with my fellow congregants to be very informative about the range of views and the levels of understanding about racism in our country and our city. We had a lay service about white privilege, which was very powerful and moving. So by the time the congregation voted, there were only 3 dissenters. So I was completely surprised and bitterly disappointed when the board said they didn't want to participate in the white supremacy teach-in just 2 years later. The board thought we had already done enough work, and the framing of white supremacy made them very uneasy. I was angry and sad and tired. We'd done so much educational work in the congregation, and to be stopped in our tracks was tough, really tough. I have to admit, I wasn't my best self when I called the board in on their cowardice and lack of support for our justice work. I told them that centering their comfort was not what we needed in this moment, but our group wasn't successful, and we were one of the few congregations that didn't participate. I found a congregation in a nearby town that did participate and went to their service. I've attended services there a few times since, and while I've kept up with my social justice committee work, the lack of support and enthusiasm from leadership for the work has made me reconsider whether that congregation is still a good place for me. I need a community committed to justice inside and outside of the organization.
We have heard today stories from our past and our present as Unitarian Universalists. These are not stories that make us feel good and fuzzy about our faith, about the ways in which, despite our aspirations to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we have too often fallen short, especially when it comes to issues of race. But luckily for us, ours is a living tradition. We need not get stuck in the mistakes of our past or even our present. Instead, we are called to learn and grow from these stories, to discover new ways of being Unitarian Universalists that truly embody those higher ideals, that dream of the beloved community. And you may be wondering, how do we do that? This is where the recommendations from the report come in. Our study group has begun to sift through those recommendations to discern where the most important work for this congregation it lies. We're not going to tell you the answers today, but we look forward to sharing more with you later this spring. For now, I leave you with these words from the closing chapter of the Widening the Circle of Concern report. In spite of the promise of our movement, we still need to address the bias and oppression within our systems to build resilience in our living traditions for the times we are in and to strengthen it for future generations. Making these changes will allow us to stay relevant. Addressing these issues will allow us to live into the theology that we profess. Furthermore, if we are committed to this work as central to our faith, we will create the conditions in which all who are attracted to the theological premises of our faith can thrive. We will create the conditions in which all who are attracted to the theological premises of our faith can thrive. May we have the courage and the commitment to make it so.